Hello and welcome to HMS Victory, the oldest commissioned warship in the world. My name is Lieutenant Commander Mike Cheshire and I'm the commanding officer of this ship. Victory was Admiral Lord Nelson's flagship during the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and indeed it is still the flagship of the Commander-in-Chief and Naval Home Command. Furthermore, the ship has over 400,000 visitors every year that come to see us. The restoration work that is being conducted is designed to restore the ship to its condition prior to the Battle of Trafalgar. The scheduled completion date for this work is a little before the year 2005, the bicentennial year of this epic battle which changed the course of European history. The purpose of this video is to give you a guided tour around the ship and also to give you some history of what life was like on board this ship during Nelson's time. So please enjoy your trip, and I'm now handing you over to your guide.
My name's Terry Hill and I'm your guide today, and I would like to start up here. There is no better place from where to appreciate the splendor of HMS Victory than from the poop deck where I'm standing now. Launched in Chatham in 1765, she represents the ultimate development of a wooden sailing man of war. Measuring 227 feet from the stern right to the tip of her bowsprit, she has a beam of 52 feet. She mounts 104 guns and fully manned carried 850 men. Victory has three masts: the foremast, the main mast, the tallest at 205 feet, and the mizzen mast here. Under full sail, she carried 16,000 square yards of canvas. This would give her a top speed of between 7 and 8 knots, around 10 miles per hour. Victory was renowned for her speed and her stability. Now from the after end of the ship, let's go right to the other end, the bows. And this, believe it or not, is where the crew of HMS Victory came to answer the call of nature. This was WC for over 800 men, and a very uncomfortable place it could be as well, with the bows plunging into icy waters in a winter's gale. The WCs on these ships were at the front end or the head of the ship, and they were known as the heads. To this very day, we still call the WCs in the Royal Navy the heads. Of course, the officers enjoyed a different lifestyle, as we shall see. A 180 feet from the heads of the ship, right in the stern in fact, is the private heads compartment of Captain Hardy's cabin. Hardy was the captain of HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, and he lived in considerable luxury. As well as this cabin, he had a sumptuous dining cabin in which he could entertain his officers and important visitors in great style. He also had a separate sleeping compartment. As captain of the ship, he was on call 24 hours a day, and so his quarters opened straight onto the deck. This part of the upper deck is known as the quarter deck, and here is the steering wheel by which the ship was steered. In calm weather, it took around 4 men to steer the ship, and anything between 6 and 8 when the weather got rough. The actual wheel was shot away during the early moments of Trafalgar, and they had to steer the ship on the lower gun deck, using the tiller and block and tackle. This box is known as the binnacle, with the 2 magnetic compasses they used in those days to navigate the world. We still use them today. Inside is the lamp for illumination at night. It was here that Lord Nelson would place himself at the height of battle to direct operations. It was here that he was pacing the deck with Captain Hardy on the 21st of October, 1805. The Victory was engaged with a French ship, the Redoutable, on the starboard side at very close quarters. As Lord Nelson turned to face aft, a sharpshooter in the mizzen fighting top of the Redoutable, spotting the Admiral's uniform, fired his musket at him. The ball entered his left shoulder, pierced both lungs, and lodged in the base of his spine. He fell to the deck mortally wounded. This brass plate marks the place where he fell. He was carried below by Sergeant Secker of the Royal Marines and 2 able seamen. And this was where they brought him, to the orlop deck. Situated just below the waterline, it was comparatively safe, and so used as the ship's hospital during battle. It was 1:15 in the afternoon when Lord Nelson was shot. They brought him down here and placed him against this structure, which is known as a ship's knee. Before he died, he had 2 requests. The first one was how the battle was going, to which they told him, "My lord, you've won the day." The second one was not to be buried at sea, but to be taken back to England and buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. His words to Captain Hardy were, "Not over the side, Hardy." After the Battle of Trafalgar, Lord Nelson was rightly revered as a national hero, and every effort would be made to fulfill his dying wish. The problem was that they were 6 weeks away from England. How were they going to get his body back? Surgeon Beatty found the answer. This large barrel is known as a leaguer, the largest barrel on board. They placed Lord Nelson's body in an empty leaguer and filled it with the ship's finest brandy. At Gibraltar, the brandy was taken out and surgical wine spirit put in its place. They got Lord Nelson's body back to England in perfect condition. Every year on the 21st of October, senior officers of the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines come down here and hold a small memorial service. They then lay wreaths against the ship's knee in honour and memory of Lord Nelson. We've seen how Lord Nelson died, now let us see how he lived. The great cabin was his living quarters whilst he was on board HMS Victory, and he enjoyed even greater luxury than Captain Hardy. This cabin is his day cabin. All the furniture in here is original and of the period, but not from HMS Victory. With one exception, the round table here is the actual table that Lord Nelson used before he was killed at Trafalgar. The dining table is similar to the one that Lord Nelson would have used to entertain captains from around the fleet and to discuss tactics. The table is still used today by the Commander-in-Chief Naval Home Command to entertain high-ranking overseas visitors and our own royalty. The picture on the easel is an oil painting done by Sir William Beechey in 1801. Lord Nelson's favourite picture of himself because the artist scaled down the background to make him look taller. In fact, he was only 5'5". Now, when this ship went to action, all the furniture and fittings in here were stripped out, folded down where possible, and placed in the hold if there was room. If not, it was placed in the ship's boats and towed astern. These were known as furniture boats. They say the French, Spanish, and the English had a gentleman's agreement not to fire on each other's furniture. When the cabin was completely cleared, 3 12-pound cannon were brought in here and placed in the stern. These were known as stern chasers. As soon as they were in position, 4 more were brought in and placed in the gun ports on either side. This would then give the ship a 320-degree firing arc. We are now in Lord Nelson's sleeping compartment, and this is a replica of his cot. When an officer joined the ship, he was measured by the carpenter, who would produce a 4-sided wooden box with a hammock tacked on to firm the cot. This would serve 2 purposes. If the officer died at sea, they'd place his body in the cot with round shot at his head and feet for weight. A lid was made and nailed on, and he was given a Christian burial over the side. To take away the drabness of sleeping in one's own coffin, the officer's lady would embroider drapery for the cot. These are replicas of the drapes embroidered by Lady Hamilton for Lord Nelson. The originals are in the National Maritime Museum in London. There was, of course, no such luxury for the ordinary serving man. Their life was a much harsher affair. This is the upper gun deck. In those days, it was known as the weather deck, as it was open to all weather, although it's covered up now. The main working deck of the ship and the punishment deck. 60% of the ship's company in those days were pressed men or non-volunteers. Discipline had to be very harsh to keep them in line. If a man committed a minor offence, he was brought up here and his feet placed in these leg irons. He could be left here for up to 100 days and fed on bread and water. If his offence was more serious, he was brought up here for 24 hours and given a rope's end. With this, he had to make his own cat o' nine tails. The next morning, the duty officer would inspect this, and if it was of good quality, he was taken to the quarterdeck and tied to a ship's grating or a cannon. His charge and punishment was read out, and his punishment carried out in front of the whole ship's company as a deterrent. The maximum on record was 500 lashes, but it was usually between 10 and 20. One blow from a naval cat, properly delivered, would take the flesh off a man's back. When his punishment was complete, they'd cut him down and put salt into his wounds. It wasn't meant to be a further punishment, it was the only antiseptic they carried. This piece of rope hardened in tar is known as a starter or a bosun's persuader. It was carried by the bosuns or the bosun's mates around this deck. If a man was seen not to be working hard enough, an officer would order the bosun to start the man. He would then receive a short, sharp crack across the back of his head or his shoulders to induce him to work harder. We are now on the middle gun deck. There are 28 24-pound guns on this deck, firing a 24-pound solid iron shot. Each gun had a crew of 12 men and a little boy known as a powder monkey. He was anything between 7 and 14, a waif or a stray taken from an orphanage or from the streets. Parents in those days would sometimes sell their children to the Navy because they couldn't afford to keep them. His main job on here was to keep the guns supplied with gunpowder charges like this, which he would fetch from the hanging magazine 2 decks below. When the gun was ready to fire, it was placed into this position, which is known as the run-out position. The men would do this using the block and tackle. The captain of the gun would prime the flintlock, pull the lanyard. This would fire the gun, which would automatically recoil until this large rope, known as the breeching rope, stopped it. Reloading would then commence. In those days, all these guns were muzzle-loaded, so all this had to be done from the front end or the mouth. First of all, they'd insert the worm or the reamer to take all the debris out of the gun and burning embers. Then the sponge to cool the barrel and douse any burning embers still in there. Finally, the rammer to ram home the charge, the shot, and the wadding. The flintlock was primed and the gun placed back into the run-out position by the men using the block and tackle. The British gunners would achieve the reload in approximately 90 seconds, which was far better than the French or the Spanish, who were taking between 3 and 5 minutes to reload and fire the same type of gun. This was because the British gunners were very well trained and practiced their drill daily. The other advantage we had was that we were using the flintlock, whereas the French and the Spanish were using a slow-burning match. This gave the British gunners more accuracy. When you pulled the firing cord, the flintlock operated and fired the gun. The slow-burning match took between 6 and 8 seconds to burn down, and by the time it ignited the charge and fired the gun, they couldn't judge the roll of the ship. The ammunition used was solid iron shot. It wasn't explosive, used to go tearing through the ship's timbers and breaking up the cannon. As they got closer to the enemy, they'd start firing this, which is known as chain shot. As it left the barrel, this would open and spin. This was fired into the sails to take down the sails. They would then start firing bar shot. This would also spin and knock out the masts. The objective behind these two was to immobilize the enemy and take his ship rather than sink it, because by taking the enemy ship, it saved you building your own. In those days, they would fight at close action. When this happened, one side would try to board the other. When they saw the enemy preparing to board, both sides would start to load this, which is known as grape shot. It's a canvas bag filled with 9 iron balls weighing about 2 pounds each, tied with string. They would load 2 or 3 of these into the gun and fire at the boarders. As they left the gun, the bags would split and the balls would leave the barrel spread, exactly the same as a large shotgun. Fire was a constant threat in those days during battle, so the powder charges were brought up to the gun decks as and when they were needed. The powder monkeys would fetch these from the hanging magazines, which were in the safest part of the ship. And this is one of those magazines. It's called the hanging magazine because of the way it was constructed, suspended between 2 decks to minimize the threat from fire and damp. This particular one is just below the orlop deck, and we're in the hold, the lowest part of the ship and the best place to appreciate the sheer size of the timbers used in Victory's construction. I'm standing just above the keel, the largest of those timbers, laid down in Chatham in 1759. This was where all the stores were carried, including sufficient food to sustain over 800 men for many weeks. And the place where the men ate their food was the same place where they lived and slept. 550 men shared their cramped quarters with 32-pound cannon. Each had a crew of 14 men and a little boy, and they lived in the space between 2 cannon known as a mess. They would eat their meals at this table, the men sitting around the table, the little boy on the biscuit barrel. It was his job to fetch the men's meals down from the kitchen or the galley. This was where the food for over 850 men was prepared. People working in the galley weren't professional chefs, just plain seamen, so badly injured in battle, through the loss of a limb, etc., that they couldn't work on the upper deck. The galley was the only place on board the ship where men were allowed to smoke. The powder monkeys would fetch the meals down from the galley in one of these vessels known as a mess trap. The first meal of the day was at around 5:30 in the morning. For this they would receive a cold porridge, and their coffee was just hot water with charred ship's biscuits broken into it to make it look like coffee. The main midday meal was pork, beef or fish stew. As there were no refrigerators in those days, all the meat had to be cured and salted and placed in casks. The Navy's policy was to use the oldest meat first. In some cases, this could mean the meat was left in a victualling yard for up to 18 months or more. So they had to boil this meat and make it into some stew before they could eat it. They also received a handful of oatmeal or dried peas. The evening meal was ship's biscuits. These were very nice hard biscuits when they were first made, but kept for some time usually contained weevils or maggots. They also received half a pound of rancid butter or half a pound of cheese, which contained red worm. This item here is known as a water butt. The little boy would fetch the men's daily ration of water in one of these up from the hold. The water in the hold was kept in casks and sometimes kept for so long it was usually slimy, brackish and had traces of salt. The only person who drank this water was the powder monkey. When he was 14 years of age, he was classed as a man, and they'd give him something better. This item is known as a spirit breaker. In this, each man over the age of 14 would receive 8 pints of beer or 2 pints of wine, half a pint of brandy or rum, depending on the climate and the conditions. Drunkenness always has been and still is a very serious offence in the Navy. People in those days were issued with tobacco. The majority of them chewed this tobacco. They weren't allowed to smoke near these guns anyway because they were always primed and loaded. The tobacco they chewed they could not swallow, as this contained a resin which would burn their stomachs. They weren't allowed to spit on the deck or over the side, as spitting in those days was seen as spitting against the crown. So these were issued. These are known as spit kids. Filled with sand and left lying around the deck, the men would spit their tobacco juices into these all day long. The powder monkey would clean the spit kid out at the end of each day using his bare hands. The bucket on the table was used to wash this area down and keep it clean. When a man joined the ship, he was issued with a hammock and a mattress, which was just a canvas bag filled with straw. Sailors would call this a donkey's breakfast. The man was also issued with a piece of stick known as a spacer, 18 inches long, used to stretch out the head of the hammock. Each man was only entitled to 18 inches of space on this deck. The spacer was regularly inspected. If it was found to be longer than 18 inches, they would lay the cat across a man's back for stealing another man's place. When a man got out of his hammock, he would lash it up like that one there. He would then take it to the upper deck and place it in the lattice netting all round the upper deck. This would give them some protection from musket shot, grape shot, and splinters when they went to battle. The hammock was also used as a life jacket. If anyone was unfortunate enough to fall over the side, the Royal Marine Sentry would throw him one of these lashed hammocks. Clinging to it, the man could stay afloat for up to 7 hours. Now, when a man died, the hammock became his coffin. They would place his body in the hammock with round shot for weight at his head and feet. The hammock was then stitched up and the man given a simple Christian burial over the side. They say that the last stitch went through the man's nose to make sure he was dead and not feigning death and trying to escape. It is very difficult for us, nearly 2 centuries after Trafalgar, surrounded as we are by comforts brought to us by modern technology, to comprehend the hardships, miseries and excitement of life on a 19th century warship. But I hope this short tour has given you a glimpse of conditions in the Royal Navy at that time, and you will be drawn, as other people are, to visit HMS Victory again.